In the year 732, two worlds collided on a cold battlefield in France. One sought to conquer, the other to survive. What happened next didn't just decide a war, it changed the future of Europe forever. This is the untold story of the Battle of Tours, the moment when history itself held its breath. If you love discovering how a single battle shaped an entire civilization, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because this is where forgotten history comes back to life. The year was 732. Europe stood on the edge of transformation, caught between two worlds, one ancient and fading, the other young and rising with unstoppable energy. Across the mountains from the sunlit lands of Iberia came a power that seemed destined to reshape the world, the forces of the Umayyad Caliphate. Their banners had already touched the Atlantic, their scholars illuminated cities with new knowledge, and their warriors carried not only swords but also the conviction of faith and destiny. To the north, beyond the Pyrenees, lay a land still recovering from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Kingdoms had risen and fallen, leaving behind fragmented territories and uncertain loyalties. Among these lands stood the realm of the Franks, strong, stubborn, and fiercely independent. Though not yet united under a single crown, they carried a spirit of endurance, shaped by struggle and survival. At the heart of this story stood two men, each representing an era, a belief, and a destiny. From the south rode Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the governor of Al-Andalus, a man of vision and discipline. He had served the caliphate with loyalty, guiding its armies with intelligence and purpose. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Abdul Rahman sought not mere plunder, but order, a stable extension of the Umayyad domain into new lands. His eyes were fixed on the fertile plains beyond the Pyrenees, on the riches of Gaul, and perhaps on the possibility of expanding the world of Islam deeper into Europe. From the north rose Charles Martel, a leader forged in the storms of internal conflict. Born not to a royal line but to a position of power through strength, Charles had spent his life defending the Frankish realm from both external enemies and internal rivals. Though officially only the mayor of the palace, he wielded authority greater than any king. His name, Martel, meaning the hammer, was not given lightly. It spoke of a man who struck decisively, shaping destiny with both wisdom and courage. In the early 8th century, the world of Europe was fragile. The memory of Rome still lingered in broken roads and fallen stones, yet no power had emerged to fill its place. Christianity spread slowly across the continent, carried by missionaries and monks who brought faith to the forests and valleys of the north. But faith alone could not protect these lands from invasion. From the east came stories of the Umayyads, their magnificent cities like Damascus and Cordoba, their libraries overflowing with knowledge, their armies undefeated across deserts and seas. For many in Europe, they were distant legends. For others, they were an approaching storm. Abdul Rahman had long prepared for this campaign. He had watched previous incursions into southern France falter, not from weakness, but from lack of unity and vision. He believed that if discipline could replace greed, the caliphate could extend its peace, its Dar al-Islam, across the entire continent. With careful planning, he gathered his forces, calling warriors from across Al-Andalus, Arabs, Berbers, and converted Europeans who had joined the Islamic world. They crossed the Pyrenees with quiet confidence, moving like a tide into the valleys and plains of Gaul. Towns fell easily, their defenses unprepared for such an organized and determined force. In the north, however, news of the invasion reached Charles Martel. Messengers rode through the forests carrying warnings of advancing armies and burning towns. Charles understood immediately what was at stake. This was not a simple raid. It was an invasion that, if left unchecked, could consume the Frankish heartlands. Yet Charles was no impulsive man. He did not rush into battle. He gathered his strength methodically, calling upon loyal nobles and local militias. He reminded them not only of the danger, but of the duty, to defend their homes, their faith, and their future. The Frankish warriors were not trained like the soldiers of the Caliphate. They were farmers, craftsmen, and hunters who fought for necessity rather than glory. But under Charles's leadership, they found unity. As autumn approached, the air grew colder, and with it, the tension of history. The two armies advanced slowly toward one another, each knowing that their meeting would determine more than just the control of land. It would decide which civilization's ideals would guide the next centuries of Europe. Between them lay the land near the city of Tours, rolling hills, dense forests, and open fields touched by the chill of early frost. Neither side knew this would become one of the most studied and debated battlefields in history. For now, it was simply a place chosen by fate. Charles Martel spent days choosing the right ground. He placed his men upon high terrain, where the Frankish infantry could stand firm, shield to shield, like an iron wall. He knew his enemies excelled in mobility, swift cavalry and archers who thrived in open plains. To defeat them, he would need patience, discipline, and faith. Abdul Rahman, in turn, studied his opponent with respect. He recognized Charles's skill, the calm of a leader who did not fear the storm. Yet he believed in his own strength, in the unity of his soldiers and the justice of his cause. He saw in this campaign not conquest for its own sake, but the continuation of a destiny that had carried Islam from the deserts of Arabia to the heart of the Western world. As the two leaders prepared, Europe held its breath. No one could yet see that this meeting would mark the boundary between two worlds, one illuminated by the crescent moon, the other by the rising cross. The wind over the plains of Gaul whispered of destiny. Somewhere between the forests and the fields, history waited. Charles Martel gazed toward the horizon, his armor catching the pale light of dawn. Behind him, thousands of Frankish warriors stood in silence, ready to defend what they loved. Far across the field, Abdul Rahman looked upon the same horizon. He, too, saw the rising sun and thought of the future, a future he hoped to shape with courage and conviction. Two leaders, two visions, one destiny. The storm was about to begin. Long before the clash at Tours, the seeds of destiny were already being sown across continents. The story of the year 732 did not begin with a single battle. It began with two worlds rising side by side, each guided by faith, ambition, and the desire to shape the future. In the east, under the burning sun of Arabia, the Umayyad Caliphate had emerged as one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen. Within barely a century after the passing of the Prophet Muhammad, the followers of Islam had built an empire that stretched from the Indus River to the Atlantic Ocean. Their scholars translated ancient wisdom into Arabic, preserving and expanding the knowledge of Greece, Persia, and Egypt. Their cities, like Damascus and Cordoba, shone as beacons of culture, art, and learning. But beyond the mountains to the north lay a land of forests and mist, a land that still bore the scars of Rome's fall. There, the Franks were forging a different kind of power. Their cities were small, their roads broken, but their spirit unbroken. Where the Umayyads built empires of stone and faith, the Franks built alliances of loyalty and blood. At the heart of the Umayyad world stood Abdulrahman al-Ghafiqi, a man born not into luxury but into discipline. He was a soldier, administrator, and visionary. As governor of Al-Andalus, the Muslim-ruled Iberian Peninsula, he inherited a land rich in culture but divided by tribal tensions. The Arabs and Berbers who had conquered Spain sometimes quarreled over authority and spoils. Abdul Rahman's genius lay in unity. He governed with fairness, balancing power and maintaining stability in a region that had known centuries of war. He dreamed of bringing the same order to the lands beyond the Pyrenees, the land of the Franks, where wealth flowed from trade routes and fertile plains, but where chaos and division still lingered. Meanwhile, in the north, another leader was rising, Charles Martel, the man who would one day be known as the Hammer. His world was not built on marble palaces or golden mosques, but on wooden halls and faith in endurance. The Frankish realm, ruled by the Merovingian kings in name, was in truth held together by men like Charles, the mayors of the palace, who commanded armies, negotiated alliances, and guarded their people. Charles was a man of contradictions, stern but wise, humble in appearance yet unmatched in leadership. He had fought not only against external enemies but against rival nobles who sought to tear his kingdom apart. From rebellion, he forged loyalty. From uncertainty, he created strength. During this time, Europe was a tapestry of fragile powers, small kingdoms, monasteries, and tribal lands. The Church was beginning to emerge as a unifying force, spreading faith through missions and learning. Yet, even the Church needed protection. The threat from the south, the expanding Islamic Empire, loomed ever larger. The Umayyads, with their advanced knowledge, organization, and wealth, seemed unstoppable. They had conquered North Africa, bringing unity and prosperity to lands that had once been divided by tribes. They crossed the Strait of Gibraltar in the early 8th century and, under the leadership of Tariq ibn Ziyad, took Hispania, the old Roman province, in just a few years. The Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula fell one by one. The victory was not only military but cultural. Cities like Toledo and Seville flourished again, this time under new rulers. Mosques and libraries rose where Roman basilicas once stood. Trade flowed across the Mediterranean, connecting Europe, Africa, and the Middle East in ways not seen since the height of Rome. But not all were content to stop there. Ambition and belief drove many to look beyond the Pyrenees, the natural barrier separating Spain from Gaul. The Muslim commanders who came after Tariq launched expeditions northward, testing the strength of the Franks. Some raids succeeded, bringing back wealth and captives. Others failed, repelled by harsh terrain and fierce resistance, yet none had achieved permanent conquest. Abdul Rahman believed he could change that. In the north, Charles Martel watched these events with wary eyes. He had seen the southern lands fall, one by one. He knew that the same fate could reach the heart of his realm if he did not act. His first challenge was to consolidate power at home. Many Frankish nobles distrusted him, and the Merovingian king still claimed authority. But Charles understood that unity was the key to survival. Through a combination of diplomacy, courage, and strategy, he won loyalty from his warriors. He reformed his armies, training his men to stand firm against cavalry, to fight not for personal gain but for the preservation of their land. He built alliances with the Church, understanding that faith could bind people together more strongly than fear. The Church, in turn, saw in Charles a protector, a leader chosen by Providence to defend the Christian world. By the time news reached him that Abdul Rahman was gathering his forces in Al-Andalus, Charles was ready. His scouts and envoys brought reports of movement, a great army preparing to cross the mountains. Charles knew what it meant. This was no ordinary raid. And so, as the year 732 drew near, two powers stood poised on the edge of history. To the south, the banners of the Umayyad Caliphate shimmered beneath the Spanish sun. Disciplined warriors led by a man of vision, confident in their mission to bring order and light to new lands. To the north, the Frankish realm stood resolute, bound together by loyalty, faith, and a leader who would soon earn his name in legend. Neither Charles Martel nor Abdul Rahman sought destruction for its own sake. Both believed they were defending something greater than themselves. One, the light of Islam, the other, the soul of Europe. The world held its breath as these two destinies began to move toward each other, step by step, across mountains and valleys. The winds of history were shifting, and far away, in the quiet plains near the city of Tours, a place waited, a place that would soon decide the course of civilizations. The wind that swept across the Pyrenees carried more than the chill of autumn. It carried the sound of hoofbeats, the shimmer of banners, and the echo of destiny. From the warm valleys of Al-Andalus to the misty hills of Gaul, the march of the Crescent had begun. For years, small raids from the south had tested the northern lands, probing their defenses, gauging their strength. But this time, it was different. This was not a mere raid for plunder. It was a campaign of conquest, guided by strategy, faith, and vision. Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the governor of Al-Andalus, had united tribes, calmed rivalries, and gathered an army not of fortune-seekers, but of disciplined soldiers. He had waited patiently for the right moment to strike, and now that moment had come. The Umayyad Caliphate, at the height of its power, had brought much of the known world under its banner. To its leaders, the campaign beyond the Pyrenees was a natural extension of progress, the spreading of order, trade, and faith. The lands of southern Gaul promised wealth and stability, a bridge between Iberia and the rest of Europe. Under Abdul Rahman's command, thousands of riders and foot soldiers began their march north. Their armor glistened under the sun. Their banners fluttered like waves in a sea of determination. Behind them, the cities of Al-Andalus watched, Cordoba, Seville, and Toledo, cities that had become jewels of art, architecture, and learning. Ahead of them lay the lands of the Franks, unknown, cold, and untamed. The first signs of the invasion came quietly. Villages along the southern frontier of Gaul awoke to find distant fires on the horizon. Traders whispered of new armies crossing the mountains. The local rulers, remnants of the old Visigothic nobility and independent lords, tried to resist, but their efforts were scattered and weak. The Muslim forces moved swiftly, taking town after town. One of their early victories was Bordeaux, a city of trade and culture near the Atlantic coast. Its defenses fell quickly, and the wealth of its markets filled the hands of Abdul Rahman's soldiers. Yet even in victory, Abdul Rahman remained cautious. He forbade unnecessary destruction, reminding his men that order must follow conquest. He was not merely collecting spoils, he was establishing a path northward, deeper into the heart of Gaul. But beyond Bordeaux, the land began to change. The hills grew thicker, the forests denser. Roads turned to mud under autumn rain. Progress slowed, and word of the invasion spread like wildfire. Messengers rode north to carry the warning. A vast army was advancing, and its leader was unlike any they had faced before. In his stronghold, Charles Martel received the reports in silence. He studied the maps, tracing with his finger the route of the invaders, from the Pyrenees to Bordeaux, from Bordeaux toward Tours. He knew this land well. Its valleys could trap an army, its forests could conceal one, and, most importantly, he knew his people. The Franks were not a polished empire, they were a mosaic of tribes and towns bound by necessity. But under strong leadership, they could become something far greater. Charles began his response with patience. Rather than rushing to meet Abdul Rahman in open battle, he gathered his forces methodically. He sent messengers to loyal nobles, monks, and warriors across the realm. The church, too, answered his call, for it understood that this conflict was more than political. It was spiritual. Men came from distant villages, carrying spears, shields, and faith. They were not professional soldiers. They were fathers, sons, and farmers. Yet they came willingly, bound by the call of duty. Charles trained them, organized them, and taught them to stand firm, shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield, like an unbreakable wall. He had learned from years of conflict that victory was not always won by numbers, but by strategy. The Muslim armies excelled in speed and cavalry maneuvers. To face them in the open fields would be folly. Instead, Charles planned to draw them into terrain that favored defense, wooded highlands where his infantry could resist cavalry charges and hold their ground. Meanwhile, Abdul Rahman continued his march. Each step brought him closer to the heart of Frankish territory. Yet with every mile he sensed the resistance growing stronger. Scouts reported that Charles Martel was gathering a large army somewhere near Tours, perhaps planning an ambush. Still, Abdul Rahman pressed on. He had faith in the skill of his men and in the justice of his mission. He envisioned a victory that would open the way to the great cities of the north, Tours, Paris, and perhaps beyond. His dream was not one of destruction, but of unity, of linking the civilizations of the south and north under a single, peaceful order. But destiny, it seemed, had other plans. As the Umayyad army advanced, the Franks moved in silence through the forests and hills. Scouts reported the enemy's movement, and Charles's forces adjusted, keeping distance but never losing sight. The two armies were like shadows chasing one another, one driven by expansion, the other by preservation. By the time Abdul Rahman's army reached the plains near Tours, autumn had deepened. The wind carried the scent of fallen leaves and the cold promise of winter. It was here, in this quiet region of Gaul, that the paths of these two men would finally cross. The villagers nearby sensed the tension of coming change. They saw soldiers on the roads, heard the sound of distant marching, and prayed in their small churches. Many did not understand the greater forces at work, empires, faiths, and destinies, but they felt the weight of something immense approaching. In the camps of the Franks, Charles walked among his men at dusk. He spoke not as a ruler, but as one of them. His presence gave them courage. His calm gave them faith. He told them that their struggle was not for conquest, but for protection, for their homes, their families, and their way of life. Across the field, Abdul Rahman did the same. He reminded his men of the honor of their mission, of the glory of discipline and the duty to bring light where there was darkness. His voice, steady and clear, carried through the night air. And so, beneath the same sky, two armies waited, neither seeking destruction, both believing they carried the truth. The sun would rise soon over the fields of Tours. No one yet knew that the coming days would echo for centuries, that songs and legends would be born from what was about to unfold. The march of the crescent had reached its end. The hammer of the Franks was ready to strike. History was holding its breath. In the heart of Gaul, as the leaves of autumn began to fall, Charles Martel stood at the crossroads of destiny. To his soldiers, he was a leader. To his enemies, a mystery. And to history, he would become the hammer, the man who would strike a blow that would echo through the centuries. Yet before he became legend, Charles was simply a man who carried the weight of a nation upon his shoulders. His world was one of uncertainty. Kings ruled in name, nobles sought power for themselves, and faith was often tested by fear. But where others saw chaos, Charles saw purpose. He was not born to a crown. His father, Pepin of Herstal, had been a powerful mayor of the palace, the true ruler behind the Merovingian throne. When Pepin died, the kingdom fractured. Rival lords rose against the young Charles, hoping to seize control. He was imprisoned, betrayed, and nearly forgotten. But destiny has a way of favoring those who endure. Charles escaped captivity, gathered loyal supporters, and reclaimed his father's lands not through luck, but through determination and skill. Each victory taught him the power of unity, the importance of discipline, and the strength that came from patience. By the time he faced the coming storm from the south, Charles had learned that the greatest weapon a leader could wield was not a sword. It was conviction. The campfires of the Frankish army flickered against the cold night. Thousands of men huddled together, wrapped in cloaks, whispering prayers to the stars above. They were farmers and shepherds, men who had left their fields and families to defend something they could not fully name: their homeland, their faith, their future. Charles walked among them quietly. He did not wear a crown or ride a golden horse. His armor was simple, his presence calm. Yet, when he spoke, his words carried strength. "Remember," he told his men, "we stand not as many tribes, but as one people. If we hold together, we will stand like stone. If we falter, we will scatter like leaves in the wind." His men listened. They trusted him, for he did not command from afar. He stood among them as one of them. Charles Martel's leadership was built upon a simple idea. Discipline could defeat chaos. The Frankish army lacked the speed and elegance of the Umayyad cavalry, but Charles understood how to turn weakness into strength. He trained his infantry to form tight, unmoving ranks, a wall of shields and spears. It was a formation inspired by the legions of old Rome, yet reborn in a new age. He also chose his battlefield carefully. He did not want to meet Abdul Rahman's cavalry on open plains, where their speed could crush his lines. Instead, he sought high ground, surrounded by forests, where his army could anchor its position and force the enemy to attack uphill. Every decision was deliberate. Every move was measured. To his enemies, it seemed as if Charles Martel waited too long to strike. But in truth, he was shaping the field before the first arrow was ever loosed. While Charles prepared his men, his mind carried the weight of something more than strategy. He thought of the generations to come, of what would be lost if his people failed. The monasteries where children learned to read the scriptures, the villages where bells called the faithful to prayer, the fragile peace that had taken years to build, all could vanish in an instant. He prayed not for conquest, but for strength. Across the field, Abdul Rahman was preparing as well. The two men, though enemies, shared a curious resemblance in spirit. Both were leaders who believed in order. Both sought to bring unity to their worlds, and both carried a sense of duty greater than ambition. Neither man wished for destruction. Yet both knew that their visions could not coexist on the same soil. The Franks called Charles Martel the Hammer, not because of a single victory, but because of his nature. He struck only when the time was right, with precision and force that could not be undone. In his tent, as the night deepened, Charles met with his commanders. Maps were spread across the table, lit by a single flame. His generals spoke anxiously about the size of the enemy army, the fear that they were outnumbered, the uncertainty of facing an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Charles listened in silence. When they finished, he looked at them and said, "Courage is not born from numbers. It is born from knowing what we fight for. They march for conquest. We stand for home." His words silenced the room. In that moment, doubt faded. Beyond the walls of the camp, the forests were alive with whispers, the rustle of branches, the distant call of owls, and the faint glow of the enemy's campfires in the distance. The two armies were close enough to see each other's lights, yet separated by the quiet of anticipation. A young soldier approached Charles before dawn. "My lord," he asked hesitantly, "are we truly strong enough to stand against them?" Charles smiled gently. "Strength is not only in the arm," he said, "but in the heart. If your heart holds, your hand will follow." The boy nodded and returned to his post, his fear replaced by something deeper, faith. That night, as the wind blew cold from the north, Charles stepped outside his tent and gazed toward the horizon. The stars shone bright above him, timeless and silent witnesses to the coming storm. He knew that the next sunrise would bring not just battle, but decision, the kind that shapes the fate of generations. Behind him slept his army. Before him waited history. He whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for courage, for his men, for his people, for all that depended upon the dawn. Somewhere, across the plain, Abdul Rahman stood beneath the same stars, his thoughts perhaps not so different. 2 leaders, 2 worlds, 2 destinies, each believing that he was the chosen instrument of a greater plan. The hour of destiny was near. The hammer was ready to strike. Dawn broke softly over the hills of Tours, its golden light spilling across a silent landscape. Mist curled like breath over the grass, and the air was cold enough to sting the lungs. To the west, the banners of the Franks fluttered gently. To the south, the crescent banners of the Umayyads shimmered in the pale glow of morning. Between them stretched a field that would soon decide the fate of a continent. Charles Martel stood at the edge of his camp, watching the sun rise through the mist. Every sound seemed louder that morning: the creak of armor, the snort of horses, the distant clang of hammers tightening shields. His men were awake, yet quiet. They knew what was coming. This was not a war for gold or glory. It was survival. Charles turned to his lieutenant, Odo of Aquitaine, the aging duke whose lands had been the first to face the southern invasion. Odo had seen the power of the Umayyad cavalry with his own eyes, had watched his cities burn and his people scatter. Yet here he stood, once an enemy of Charles, now his ally. "Do you believe they will attack today?" Charles asked. Odo nodded slowly. "They have waited long enough. Their scouts have tested our lines for days. They will come before nightfall." Charles looked across the plain, his gaze steady. "Then we will be ready." In the Frankish camp, men prepared for battle with a solemn calm. Some knelt in prayer, clutching wooden crosses carved by their families. Others whispered to one another about home, the laughter of children, the smell of bread, the sound of the church bells that echoed across their villages. A young soldier named Arnulf sat sharpening his blade beside the campfire. His hands trembled slightly, though he tried to hide it. He had never fought in a battle of this scale. To him, the Umayyads were not men, but shadows from faraway lands, swift, ruthless, unstoppable. An older veteran noticed his unease and smiled gently. "Fear is no shame," he said. "It means your heart remembers what it wants to protect." Arnulf nodded, clutching his sword tighter. He looked toward Charles Martel's tent, where the leader stood speaking softly with his commanders. "Do you think we can truly win?" he asked. The old man looked at the mist-covered hills and then back at the boy. "We follow a man who has never bowed to fear. That is worth more than numbers." As the sun climbed higher, a strange stillness settled over the field. The Frankish army formed in ranks, a wall of shields, immovable and silent. Each man stood shoulder to shoulder, the line stretching across the hillside like a living fortress. Charles had chosen his ground perfectly. Dense forests flanked both sides, limiting the enemy's cavalry. The slope forced the Umayyads to fight uphill, where their horses would lose momentum. It was a field chosen not for glory, but for endurance. To the south, Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi rode before his men. His army was vast and brilliant, horsemen clad in shining mail, archers with curved bows, banners embroidered with gold. His soldiers came from across the empire: Arabs, Berbers, Syrians, all united under faith and conquest. He looked toward the Frankish line and felt a flicker of curiosity. These men did not charge. They did not retreat. They simply stood, silent, waiting. For a moment, Abdul Rahman wondered if they were afraid, or if they knew something he did not. Back in the Frankish line, Charles Martel moved among his soldiers, offering words not of fire, but of calm strength. "Hold your ground," he said. "Do not break ranks. No matter what you see, no matter what you hear, stand as one." His voice carried through the ranks like a steady drumbeat. When he passed Arnulf, the young soldier felt something strange, a sense of peace. The man before him was not larger than life, not radiant or untouchable. He was human, but his courage seemed to draw courage from others, as if every man who stood near him became stronger. "Remember," Charles said, "the first to lose faith will doom us all." Then he turned and took his place among the front lines. Hours passed. The sun reached its peak. The two armies faced each other in silence, each waiting for the other to move. Then, from the southern hills, a single horn sounded, long and low, like the cry of a beast. The Umayyad cavalry began to advance. Dust rose from the plain, turning the air golden. The ground trembled beneath the thunder of hooves. The Franks gripped their shields tighter, their breath quickening. The first wave came fast, a storm of riders with curved swords glinting in the sunlight. They shouted war cries that echoed across the field. Arrows whistled through the air. Charles raised his hand and called, "Stand firm!" The impact was like a wave crashing against a cliff. The Frankish line shook but did not break. Shields splintered, spears bent, but the men held together, shoulder to shoulder as one wall. The Umayyad cavalry pulled back, regrouped, and charged again. Still, the Franks held. As the battle raged through the afternoon, both leaders watched with keen eyes. Abdul Rahman saw his cavalry's strength blunted by the terrain and the unyielding Frankish formation. Charles saw his men beginning to tire, yet their resolve only deepened. It became not a battle of swords, but of will. When the sun began to sink, the field was covered with dust and silence. The Umayyads withdrew to their camp, and the Franks stood victorious for the day. But both knew that the true test was yet to come. Charles looked over the weary faces of his men, and his heart swelled with pride. They had faced the might of an empire and did not falter. He turned to Odo. "They will come again tomorrow," he said. Odo nodded grimly. "Then we will stand again." That night the wind carried the faint sound of distant prayers. Two armies, two faiths, both appealing to the same sky for strength. Charles sat by the fire, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He felt the weight of destiny pressing on his shoulders. The fate of Europe rested not in kings or nobles, but in the hearts of common men who chose to stand firm. And as he closed his eyes for a brief moment of rest, he whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, the world will change." The sun rose on the second day with a quiet brilliance, casting long shadows across the misty plains near Tours. The air was cold and heavy, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Two armies faced each other again, weary, determined, and aware that this day would decide everything. Charles Martel stood at the crest of a hill, his cloak rippling in the wind. Below him, his men were forming ranks once more, shields raised, spears ready, faces pale with fatigue but lit by resolve. They had survived the storm of the previous day, but now came the true test. To the south, the Umayyad camp stirred with energy. Tents rippled as commanders shouted orders. Horses were saddled, banners lifted, and the rhythmic beat of war drums echoed through the valley. Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, tall and commanding, rode among his troops. His calm presence inspired loyalty even in exhaustion. He had not come this far to retreat. Abdul Rahman knew the strength of his cavalry, the discipline of his men, and the faith that guided them. But he also knew time was not his ally. The Frankish resistance had slowed his progress, and the longer he lingered, the greater the risk that reinforcements might come from other Frankish lands. So, as the mist began to lift, he gave the signal to advance. The sound that followed was like thunder rolling across the earth. Thousands of horses charged in perfect rhythm, their hooves pounding against the frozen ground. The Umayyad cavalry swept forward like a living tide, glinting in the sunlight, a force that had conquered kingdoms from the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of Iberia. Charles Martel's men stood still. "Hold!" His voice rang out across the ranks carried by the wind. "Do not move until they reach us." The Franks waited, their shields locked, their spears angled forward. The ground shook beneath them. A roar of courage and terror filled the air as the Umayyad riders closed the distance. 100 paces, 50, 20. Then impact. The cavalry crashed into the Frankish line with all its fury. The sound was deafening. Shields splintered, weapons clashed, cries of strain filled the air. Yet the wall of Franks held. Like rooted trees in a storm, they refused to break. Abdul Rahman watched from his horse, his eyes narrowing. His men were brave, their strikes fierce, but the Franks were immovable. Again and again, the cavalry pulled back, regrouped, and charged. Each time, the Frankish formation absorbed the blow and closed ranks once more. It was a battle of endurance, not chaos. A slow, grinding contest of strength and will. As the day wore on, dust began to fill the air, blurring the edges of the battlefield. The sun hung low, red and heavy. Both sides were exhausted, their voices hoarse, their arms trembling from the endless struggle. In the midst of the chaos, a rumor began to spread among the Umayyad ranks. Whispers that their camp, filled with treasure and supplies, was being raided by Frankish scouts. It was a false rumor, perhaps started by the Franks themselves, but its effect was immediate and devastating. Small groups of Umayyad soldiers began to pull away from the front lines, anxious to protect their belongings. Confusion spread like fire through the ranks. Abdul Rahman saw it happening and spurred his horse forward, shouting for order. "Return to the line," he commanded. "Victory is before us, not behind." But his voice was lost in the chaos. The Frankish army, seeing the disorder, seized the moment. Charles Martel lifted his hand and shouted, "Now!" With a cry that echoed across the field, the Franks surged forward for the first time. Their wall of shields became a wave of steel. They pushed into the fractured Umayyad line, driving their spears and swords with grim determination. The tide had turned. In the swirl of battle, Abdul Rahman fought valiantly, refusing to retreat. Surrounded by his loyal guard, he tried to rally his men, urging them to hold their ground, but confusion had taken root too deeply. In the chaos, amid the dust and shouting, the Umayyad leader was struck down. When word of his fall spread, the spirit of the southern army began to falter. Commanders tried to restore order, but the will to fight was broken. As dusk fell, the Umayyad forces began to withdraw, first in small groups, then in waves. The once mighty army that had crossed mountains and conquered kingdoms now retreated silently into the night. Charles Martel watched from the hillside, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion. He did not cheer. He did not celebrate. He simply watched as the battlefield grew quiet, the setting sun painting the horizon in shades of crimson and gold. He turned to Odo and said softly, "It is done." Odo nodded, his voice heavy with both relief and sorrow. Europe will remember this day. As night fell, the field lay still. The mist returned, covering the scars of battle. The men of both sides tended to their wounded, whispering prayers into the cold air. Charles walked among his soldiers, offering a nod or a word to those who met his gaze. When he looked up at the stars, he felt not triumph, but humility. He knew that history often turns quietly, not with the roar of victory, but with the endurance of those who refuse to fall. He whispered a simple prayer. May those who fought today, on both sides, be remembered. And with that, he turned away from the field that had decided the fate of a continent. Far away, news of the battle would travel slowly, across mountains, through kingdoms, along the roads of scholars and traders. In time, it would be called the Battle of Tours, or the Battle of Poitiers. Some would say it saved Europe. Others would say it merely delayed the inevitable tides of history. But for those who stood upon that cold, misty field in 732, it was more than history. It was the moment they discovered the strength of endurance, the power of unity against the odds. The morning after the battle was eerily quiet. A pale mist hung low over the fields near Tours, softening the edges of what had once been the stage of fury and fate. The sounds of steel and shouting were gone. In their place came the whisper of wind through grass and the faint tolling of church bells from distant villages, a sound that seemed to bless the land with peace after a storm. Charles Martel stood among his soldiers, his armor dulled by dust, his cloak torn at the edges. Around him, the Frankish warriors moved slowly and silently, tending to the wounded, gathering supplies, and offering prayers for both friend and foe. The night had been long, and few had slept. Victory, though certain, felt heavy. War, even one fought in defense, left a mark that glory could not erase. Odo of Aquitaine approached, his face weary but calm. "They have gone," he said. "The scouts report that the southern army retreated across the mountains during the night. The road to the Pyrenees is clear." Charles nodded slowly. Then the land breathes again. He looked toward the horizon, where the mist gave way to faint sunlight. But peace is never free. It is built upon vigilance. For the Franks, the battle was more than a victory. It was a revelation. Word of Charles Martel's triumph spread quickly through the valleys and forests of Gaul. Messengers carried the news northward, through monasteries and markets, across rivers and towns. People whispered his name with reverence: Martel, the hammer, the man who stood when others would have fallen. In distant lands, kings and nobles listened with cautious admiration. Some saw the battle as a divine sign, proof that the Christian kingdoms of the north could stand against the great empires of the south and east. Monks began to write of it in their chronicles, describing it as a clash of worlds, one faith meeting another, one civilization halting the advance of another. Yet Charles himself never saw it that way. When asked by his advisers what the victory meant, he simply said, "It means our people may live another day." He knew that history often magnified moments, shaping them into symbols greater than the truth. To him, the battle was not a crusade, but a defense, a stand for survival, not conquest. In Al-Andalus, news of the defeat reached Córdoba with quiet shock. Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the noble governor who had dreamed of unity and order, was mourned as a hero. He had led his army with courage and wisdom, and his loss was felt deeply across the caliphate. Yet even in loss, the spirit of Al-Andalus endured. The great cities of the south, Córdoba, Toledo, and Granada, continued to flourish. Scholars, poets, and scientists filled their streets with learning. The dream of expansion into Gaul faded, but the legacy of culture and knowledge only grew stronger. From this turning point, two worlds began to evolve, not as enemies, but as mirrors of each other's strength. In the months following the battle, Charles Martel turned his attention inward. He knew the Franks were not yet a unified nation. The kingdoms of the West were fragile, held together by alliances and oaths rather than lasting order. He began to reform his armies, fortify his borders, and strengthen the bonds between noble families. He also worked closely with the church, ensuring that monasteries and schools would flourish under protection. To Charles, faith and governance were not separate. Both were tools to build stability in a world still haunted by the ghosts of Rome. One evening, as he rode through a quiet village rebuilt after the battle, children ran beside his horse, laughing. He smiled faintly, though his heart remained heavy. Odo, riding beside him, noticed the silence. "You should be proud," Odo said softly. "You have saved these lands." Charles looked out at the rolling hills, dotted with smoke from chimneys. "I have only given them time," he replied. "It is what they build with it that will decide their future." Beyond the borders of the Frankish realm, the ripples of Tours reached far. In the centuries to come, chroniclers would write that the battle saved Europe from conquest, that Charles Martel had turned back the tide of a powerful empire. But those who lived it knew the truth was more complex. The Umayyads had not sought destruction, but expansion, the spread of trade, language, and law. And the Franks had not fought for conquest, but preservation. In a sense, both sides carried light. One through faith and knowledge, the other through endurance and unity. The field at Tours had been the meeting point of two great civilizations, neither extinguishing the other, but instead shaping the path of history together. As the seasons turned and years passed, Charles's victory became legend. Songs were sung in his honor, priests invoked his name in prayers. His leadership paved the way for his descendants, the Carolingians, to rise. In time, his grandson, Charlemagne, would build an empire that stretched across much of Europe. But in his final years, Charles Martel remained humble. In a letter written to a close companion, he reflected, "History will remember kings and battles, yet it is the hearts of simple men that hold the world together. We are all builders of tomorrow, with faith, with courage, and with mercy." Those words would outlive him, carried in the chronicles of monks who preserved his story for generations. Far to the south, in Córdoba, a scholar of the Umayyad court once wrote of the same battle, though from a different perspective. The men who stood against us were fierce, their leader wise. We fought not against darkness, but against equals in strength and faith. May the world learn that even in struggle there can be respect. It was a sentiment that echoed across the ages, proof that even the fiercest conflicts could leave behind not hatred, but understanding. In the fading light of his last years, Charles Martel often walked through the gardens of his home in Austrasia. He would look toward the west, where the sun dipped below the horizon, and think of the men who had stood beside him at Tours. He never called himself a hero. He never sought glory. He only hoped that the peace bought with their courage would last longer than their lifetimes. And though centuries would pass and empires would rise and fall, the world would still remember the day when two great forces met, and the fate of Europe was forever changed. Centuries have passed since that cold morning near Tours, when two armies faced each other beneath the pale autumn sun. The earth that once trembled with the thunder of hooves now lies silent, covered in wildflowers and whispering grass. Yet the memory of that battle, of courage, conviction, and destiny, still echoes through the corridors of time. Historians have debated its meaning for ages. Was it a clash of civilizations, a divine victory, or simply one of many turning points that shaped the fragile map of medieval Europe? The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere between legend and legacy. When Charles Martel led his weary men home after the battle, he did not carry himself as a conqueror. He returned as a guardian, a leader who had defended his people from what many believed to be an unstoppable force. In the hearts of his men, he had become a symbol of endurance, the embodiment of the will to protect rather than to destroy. Under his guidance, the Frankish realm entered a new era. Roads were repaired, churches rebuilt, and schools opened within monastery walls. He reformed the armies that had saved Gaul, ensuring that future generations would never stand unprepared before the tides of history again. But perhaps the most profound legacy he left was unity, a sense of shared purpose among the fragmented tribes of Europe. For centuries, the continent had been a mosaic of divided kingdoms and wandering loyalties. After Tours, there emerged a vision that Europe could stand together under faith, discipline, and leadership. From this vision, a dynasty was born. Charles's descendants would carry forward his spirit. His son, Pepin the Short, would become king of the Franks, and his grandson, Charlemagne, would go on to be crowned Emperor of the Romans, the first in centuries to unify much of Western Europe under one rule. It was a vision of renewal, the rebirth of order from the ruins of Rome. Scholars, builders, and theologians flocked to Charlemagne's courts, where learning once again flourished. The seeds of that revival, however, had been planted on the blood-chilled soil of Tours, where Charles Martel proved that faith and endurance could turn back the tide of history. Yet the legacy of the battle was not one of triumph over another people. It was, instead, a moment of balance, a pause between worlds that allowed both civilizations to grow in their own directions. To the south, across the Pyrenees, the Umayyad Caliphate endured. Though their expansion northward had ended, their achievements in Al-Andalus blossomed into something extraordinary. Córdoba became a beacon of learning, its libraries vast, its architecture breathtaking, its scholars among the greatest minds of the age. While Europe rebuilt through faith and fortitude, Al-Andalus rose through knowledge and art. Philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and mathematics reached new heights beneath the Andalusian sun. The wisdom of the Greeks, preserved and expanded by Muslim scholars, would one day flow back into Europe through the very lands once defended at Tours, sparking the intellectual rebirth known as the Renaissance. Thus, what many had seen as a victory of one world over another became, in truth, an exchange of light. For centuries, storytellers and monks would write of Charles Martel's victory as divine providence, a moment when Europe was saved from conquest. Yet modern eyes see more deeply. The battle did not divide the world into darkness and light. Rather, it marked a meeting of two great streams of civilization that would one day nourish each other. Without the endurance of the Franks, Europe might have lost the space it needed to recover and rebuild. Without the brilliance of Al-Andalus, Europe might never have regained the knowledge it had forgotten. In this balance of defense and discovery, of sword and scholarship, history found its rhythm. In the quiet of monasteries, monks copied texts that would one day inspire thinkers across Europe. In the bustling cities of the Caliphate, scientists observed the stars, laying the foundations for modern astronomy. And through trade, diplomacy, and curiosity, the once opposing worlds began to share what they had preserved: wisdom, art, and faith. Even the landscape of Tours became a symbol. Pilgrims traveled there for generations, not to celebrate conquest, but to remember the courage of those who stood firm. Many centuries later, a historian would write, "The battle at Tours was not the end of a world, but the preservation of its possibility." It was a poetic truth. The victory of Charles Martel gave Europe time to rebuild, to rediscover itself, to prepare for the dawn of new ideas. The retreat of the Umayyads, meanwhile, allowed their culture to concentrate and refine itself into one of the most radiant civilizations the world had ever known. From that fragile balance came the Europe we know, a tapestry woven from courage, curiosity, and countless connections between faiths and peoples. In the end, the true legacy of the Battle of Tours is not found in conquest, but in endurance. It is the story of a world that refused to be consumed by the flames of chaos, and of another that chose to shine through knowledge rather than through war. Charles Martel never lived to see the full flowering of the world he helped preserve, but his name would echo across the centuries, not as a man of violence, but as a man of resolve. He once said to a trusted monk before his death, "Victory is not in the sword, but in the heart that holds steady when all else trembles." Those words became the quiet truth of his legacy. And so, the year 732 remains etched in history, not merely as a battle, but as a turning of destiny. It was the day when two civilizations met, tested each other, and through that meeting, both were transformed. The cross and the crescent did not extinguish one another. They coexisted in tension, in dialogue, and in destiny. From their meeting arose the Europe of kings and cathedrals, of libraries and universities, of poetry and discovery. The field of Tours reminds us still, history is not written by the loudest conqueror, but by the quiet endurance of those who stand for something greater than themselves. And in that quiet, in the mist that still rises over the hills of France, the echo of that ancient morning remains. And so, from the fields of Tours to the pages of history, the echoes of that moment still whisper through time. It was not just a battle of swords and shields. It was a clash of faiths, destinies, and visions for the world. In that single encounter, Europe stood at a crossroads and chose the path that would shape its identity for centuries to come. History reminds us that even the smallest choices, the courage of a few, the resolve of one, can change the course of humanity forever. Thank you for watching. If you believe history should never be forgotten, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because every story from the past helps us understand the world we live in today.